In fact, I'll go so far as to say that what we should be saying is we expect you to become liberated, and I'll give you a benchmark. You need to become religiously literate. I say this in the same sense that Stephen Prothero, who wrote the book a few years ago called Religious Literacy, meant when he observed by doing some studies, polling, that most people don't know much religion at all, including their own, that only one teenager in 10 could name more than one gospel. And if they couldn't name that, you can imagine how little else they knew. He calls this the fourth R, religion, that our lack of religious literacy is hurting us as a country, and I don't disagree with it. But I'm just stepping back and saying, I think it's time for Fountain Street Church to expect each of us to become religiously literate. And I know this treads on a sacred resistance to authority we bring in the door with us. I have more than once said that Fountain Street Church is the church of "you're not the boss of me." And I can hear your brain saying, wait a minute, what do you mean you expect me to do something? For this is a liberal church, you can't tell me what to do. Well, yes, I can. You don't have to pay attention, but I can tell you. And I can ask you to measure yourself by this. Are you capable of making religious decisions in a fully informed way? That doesn't mean that there's a test, although I think there is. But now I'm going to tell you a story so you can understand why it's important that I ask this of you. It's an old story about the rabbinical school where a student came in to see the head of the school, a very old rabbi. And the young student came in and said, "Rabbi, I have to leave. I can't stay anymore." And the old rabbi tugged on his beard and said, "Why is that?" And the young rabbi with his payas said, I've decided I'm an atheist." The rabbi pulled on his beard and said, "Really? And after a few moments he said, "Tell me, how long have you been studying here at the yeshiva?" 10 years, said the young man with an evident amount of pride. 10 years, said the old rabbi. Only 10 years, and you think you have the ability to call yourself an atheist? You have to study at least 20 years before you can make up your mind like that. Get back to class. But the point is very simple. When do we ever reach a point when we have finished deciding our minds? When we have reached a conclusion that cannot be revoked? When do we reach a point when we can be confident in our judgment when there is so much to learn? We go to school for a reason. We all know we go to school for a reason, because we cannot liberate ourselves. We must learn the liberal arts in order to be liberated, because that was the whole idea. How can you take your place in the world if you don't know how to read and write, if you cannot do mathematics? This is not because you need a job, it's because you need to be a citizen capable of doing these things in the world itself. I started talking about this back in 2008. I'm renewing it now because I think it's important for us to clear the mistaken notion that a free religion, a liberal religion, expects nothing, means you can do anything you want. You cannot do anything you want until you know what you're doing. And how many years you've been at this church? Whatever it is, you need at least 10 more before you can make up your mind. Because liberating your mind is a life task. It doesn't end just because you are tired of thinking. It doesn't end because you don't want to do it anymore. It's hard work to be part of this church. If I'm not going to tell you what to believe, I will insist that you figure out what the blazes you do believe, and I'm going to pick it apart until you can defend it or change it. I believe absolutely that just as our political rights come with responsibilities, our religious rights come with responsibilities. And this place and places like it exist to educate each other about those responsibilities. For example, Back in 2008, I put together a little pamphlet in response to Stephen Prothero's book. It's titled, Way More Than 100 Things That Every Religious Liberal Should Know. I picked out 10 of them, right out of the middle. They're actually 184 words or phrases. I don't need you to turn up the lights, but if you want to, you can raise your hand. I'm going to mention 10 of them. They're all in alphabetical order. If you've heard of this or have some notion of it, raise your hand. I won't be testing you now. Has anyone here ever heard of the Good Samaritan? That's a good showing. How about the Great Awakening? Not so many. Who here knows the Guru Nanak? Ooh. Can anyone tell me what hadith is? Amen. Or halal? Hanukkah. Hare Krishna. Hasidism. Hijab. Heresy. A lot of us. You remember the names you were called, right? High Holy Days. Hinayana and Mahayana. Well, for a church that's full of smart people, I should have seen way more hands. Which doesn't mean I'm being critical. What it means is your job is not done. There are 173 more, and I made up that list in an hour and a half 6 years ago. And you're right. If it were up to me, I would give it to you all as a test, not to get a grade. But that way you would know where you need to go in order to continue your liberation of your mind, of your religious mind. You know, we keep saying we want a world with more accountability and clearer expectations and higher standards. Well, I got them. Are you willing to try them? Because it should apply to us as well. A liberal church is not one without standards or without expectations or without accountability. It's one in which you are trusted to live up to it without coercion or constant observance. This month is about imagination. Jason has asked us all to think imaginatively. Well, I'm going to imagine for a moment, and maybe you can join me, that we can stretch our minds and see a religious community, one that looks a lot like this one, that is bound together by a holy curiosity about religion. And I do mean holy, in that we're so interested in it, not just abstractly, we really want to understand what's going on. A community that sees all the faiths and faith traditions much like different languages. You know, when you learn a second language, you don't all just learn a new way of speaking and thinking. You learn more about your old way of speaking and thinking, don't you? When you reflect on a new language, you think about your old language. We get insight both ways. Remember Thomas Merton? I mentioned him earlier. He began to study Buddhism into his 50s. And he got criticized for not criticizing them for not being Christian. But he said, I believe that by openness to Buddhism, to Hinduism, to the great Asian traditions, we stand a wonderful chance of learning more about the potential of our Christian traditions. You know he speaks the truth. And likewise for you in your journey, wherever you've come from, wherever you are, by stepping outside of that, learning at least a few words in a different religious vocabulary, you will find you know yourself even better. Because that's exactly what Merton was saying during the lesson earlier, that our task is to give birth to ourselves. And that's what spiritual education is. It is the process of spiritual birth, spiritual rebirth. We hear it in the famous words from John that we have to be born again, and that's what Merton is talking about. But let's remember those first two passages I gave you. Jesus went to be baptized. Does that mean he needed to be cleansed of sin? No. It meant that he was marking a beginning in his life, a new chapter. He was matriculating into the next stage of his spiritual education. He was going from being a student, in fact, to being a teacher. And a ritual like baptism marks those transitions as we go from one stage of our life to another. Likewise, in the story of Israel being freed by being liberated from Egypt, it goes through a passage of water and becomes a different nation. They were freed to become who they had to become. Liberation of mind and soul and body is what this faith is about, but it cannot come about without you taking part in your own birth, your own spiritual rebirth. As one who has labored over this many times, I can tell you that every spiritual rebirth is as painful as the last one. And that no matter how many you've been through, there's at least one more ahead of you. And it never, ever gets easy. I also know that it is worth it each and every time. So I put it to you, friends. Are you willing to be accountable for your own soul? Are you willing to have expectations placed upon you? Are you willing to reach for something that you are not in order to become the person you need to become? I can't make you do it. That is the liberal way. But I guarantee that if you do it, it's worth it. See you in church.
We choose not to make a church that requires your assent to particular thoughts, but we do choose to make a church, an ecclesia, a discerning body that would ask you to go home today, to that place where you gather, whether it is your kitchen table or some other nook or cranny of the place you call home, and open yourself to another and acknowledge your need to become more. This is the rhythm of Epiphany. And we gather so that we can help one another to do this grand and beautiful thing. May it be your practice this week that you find a place here at church, there at home, amidst your co-workers, or simply on the streets of our city, where you pause long enough to see the great courage that already exists within you to become that more you have been made to be. Go in peace, friends.